Welcome to Train Signal. You are watching the first part of the video for Lab 2, installing remote installation services and deploying clients. We will be covering several topics in this video. The first topic will be client deployment options. The second will be the prerequisites for RIS. The third topic will be installing and configuring RIS. And finally, we'll do a live example of deploying Microsoft Windows XP Professional using remote installation services. So let's get started. One of the biggest challenges in a business is to actually prepare the computers for users to be able to use them and get productive immediately. There are several options. Let's look at those options. I'm going to go on to the next screen. Here we go. One of the first options is the most simplest one, and also it takes the longest time. You can install the operating system and applications using CD. So in this option, you'll be going from computer to computer, install the operating system, install the applications. I'm sure you've done this one time or another and know that this can take a tremendous amount of time. There is no standardization. If there are problems, then you have to go back and fix the problems using the CDs. It just takes too much time. The next option, which gets a little bit better, is instead of taking the CDs from computer to computer, what you can do is the following. You can go to a central server, we're going to call it the network server, copy all the CDs over there and share them. And then go to each client, connect to that particular server, and then install the operating systems and the applications from there. In this method, you can also use some automation tools such as an answer file to make your task a little bit easier. But again, this requires you to go around from one computer to another. The only difference is that instead of you doing it from CDs, you have a central server from which you can feed the source codes of all the operating systems and the applications. Also, you got to remember that this will take up a lot of network bandwidth and may actually slow down the process. So what you make up for going around from each person and having multiple copies of CDs available, you lose by actually having network bandwidth problems. But these are the two most common methods deployed to actually install clients. However, they are inefficient. So let's go on to see what automation tools are available to actually deploy the operating systems and applications on computers. One of the methods that is getting very popular, and we have discussed it in our last series of videos in Active Directory, namely Lab 14, is the following. What you can do is the following. You go to each computer and install the operating system any way you want. You can do it manually or any other methods, including the methods that we're going to discuss next. And then what you do is the following. Let the users log on to the domain, and the group policy objects, namely the GPOs, will automatically deploy or push exactly the applications that each client needs to their desktops. We have seen this in the last series of videos, namely Lab 14, application deployment. So this is a great method also. All you have to do is make sure that the operating systems are currently installed on each and every client, and then when the user logs in, automatically the applications will be deployed to their desktop. So this is definitely a better method than the previous two that we've talked about. Going further, there is a new method that started with Windows 2000 Server known as RIS, Remote Installation Services. This is used to deploy operating systems. It can also be used to deploy applications as well. And in our videos, we're going to do both of these methods. We're going to deploy the operating system first and then the applications later on. There are some restrictions with these methods, but overall, this works great for deploying applications as well as operating systems. The biggest restriction that I can tell you right away about RIS is that this is valid only for operating systems Windows 2000 Professional, Windows XP Professional, and Server 2003 only. So at this point, only these three operating systems are supported using RIS. And the last method, which we will do in one of the videos in this series, is using Ghost. This is a true imaging software. It takes a picture of the client and deploys the client exactly on a number of computers simultaneously. So let's get started with remote installation services. After all, this is the topic for this video. So what is remote installation services? Let's go on to the next screen here. Remote installation services is a service that is included with Windows 2000 Server and with Windows 2003 Server so that you could deploy operating systems such as Windows 2000 Professional. You can also deploy Windows XP Professional and Windows Server 2003 in different flavors. Please note that you cannot deploy Windows 2000 Server using RIS. Also, older clients or legacy clients such as Windows 98 or Windows 95 for that matter, cannot be installed using RIS. So there are several restrictions. The way the service works is the following. I'm going to explain this to you with this figure, and then we will translate this into our own benbrady.com network. What you require is the following. Before you actually ensure that RIS works, we have to meet the following prerequisites. And here are the prerequisites. Let's go through those and then let's understand how the service will actually work. Now, the prerequisites I've divided into two parts, on the server side and on the client side. Once again, there are restrictions on both sides. Let's first talk about the server side. On the server side, you need to have Windows 2000 or Windows 2003 server installed, because RIS is a service that can be installed only on those operating systems. So that's the first requirement. Make sure that you have Windows 2000 or Windows 2003 server available in your domain. Now, in your domain, you must have Active Directory. In other words, as long as you have a domain controller, you have Active Directory, you can use RIS as a deployment method. You cannot use RIS for workgroup computers. The next requirement is that you must have a DNS server. Again, no big deal. The fact that you have Active Directory, the fact that you made a server, a domain controller in your domain, automatically implies that you have a DNS server installed in your network. And last but not the least, on the server side, once again, is the presence of a DHCP server. So you must have a DHCP server. This is a server that actually assigns IP address to the clients when the client tries to connect to the remote installation server to obtain the image. So these are the three requirements. You must have Windows 2000 on your computer, or Windows 2003 on your computer. Active Directory must be installed. You must have DNS. You must have DHCP server. Once these requirements are met, you can go ahead and install the remote installation services from the control panel, and we'll be doing exactly that. So these are the requirements on the server side. Now on the client side also there is just one requirement, but a very important one. On the client, you must have a client that is what is known as a PXE client, or a pre-boot execution client. This is a client that has a special ROM on its motherboard that will try to hunt for an operating system if it does not find the operating system in the traditional locations, such as the hard disk or the CD-ROM and so forth. So what this client does is the following. When it boots up, it goes to the boot sequence and then tries to find the operating system on the floppy disk if it can boot from it, or the CD-ROM, or the hard disk. If it fails in all these three locations, then it will send out a packet on the network cable, hoping to find a server that has the operating system that it can hook up with and then deploy that operating system. So that's what a pre-boot execution client does. If your computer is already loaded with this PXE chip, you're all set. However, if you do not have the PXE client, all is not lost. What you can do is the following. As long as you have a NIC card in your computer that supports a PXE environment, you can actually create a boot floppy that will emulate the pre-boot execution environment for you. So once again, if you have pre-boot execution chip on your computer, you're all set. However, if you don't have that, make sure you have a NIC card that supports this, and in the lab I'll be showing you examples of NIC cards that do support the PXE environment. And then there is a program in Server 2003 that will let you create a boot floppy. When you boot the computer with that floppy disk, it will actually simulate the pre-boot execution environment, and you'll be able to deploy the operating system on this computer using RIS. So once again, on the server side, you have the following requirements. On the client side, you have just one requirement, either this or this. Please note, you don't need both. If you have this, great. If you do not have this, we'll create a floppy disk. In our lab, I'm going to actually show you how to create a floppy disk, so that if you ever have to do that on your computer, you're able to do so. Okay, let's put all this together now. This is how the service is going to work. And here's a diagram that will help you understand this. Here's a remote installation server. In other words, I have my prerequisites met. I have Active Directory. Here's the directory services icon over here. I have a DHCP server in my network. I have a DNS server, and now I'm ready to install remote installation services on one of the servers. Of course, all this can be on the same server, like we will do in our example. All these services will actually run on the server DC1. Okay, so these are installed, and here's my client waiting for the hookup between this and this so that it can actually get the operating system. Now, this is how the process works. When the client boots up and it finds that it does not have an operating system on its hard disk, it will use the PXE environment, namely the floppy disk or the PXE chip itself, to actually send out a packet and obtain an IP address. So what happens is the following. It sends out a DHCP discover packet and tries to obtain an IP address so it can be part of the network. And the binary service takes care of that. there is a binary service on the server running that makes sure that when the client contacts the server for an IP address, the DHCP server is going to respond, and then the remote installation services client wizard will be loaded from here to over here. So that's the next service known as the TFTPD service. This stands for Trivial File Transfer Protocol Daemon. So once again, you're familiar with FTP. This is simply Trivial FTP, meaning that it is a very basic service that lets you transfer files from here to over here. So once again, the client boots up, it obtains the IP address through the DHCP server, so now it's part of the network, and then it contacts the remote server looking for an operating system. The remote server will use the binary service to actually transfer what is known as CIW, or Client Installation Wizard, from over here to the PXE client. And then you basically answer questions. Once you answer a few basic questions, then the operating system will actually come from the remote installation server to the client using the service known as TFTPD service, namely Trivial File Transfer Protocol Daemon service. Last but not the least, there is another service that is at work over here called SIS, known as Single Instance Store. This service is only there for efficiency, and I'll show you this later on. What you can do is you can have more than one client images residing on the remote installation server, and the PXE client can actually choose that, okay, I want image number 1 or image number 2 or image number 3. When you create several images, and if you recall that your operating system can only be Windows 2000 Professional, Windows XP Professional, or Windows 2003 servers in its different formats, then what the remote installation server does is that rather than create the image all over again, it takes the base image and avoids duplicating files that it already has. For example, in the first image, let's say you have Windows XP Professional only, and in the second image you have Windows XP Professional along with Microsoft Office applications in that image. Well, it is ridiculous to repeat all the files that were in the first image in the second image. So what SIS does is that it says that, well, I already have the files for Windows XP Professional, let me just make a difference file that will give me the files that are required for Microsoft Office applications only. So Single Instance Store is a service that ensures that there is efficiency in the way these images are stored on the hard disk. And that's it. The files will be transferred using TFTP to the clients. The client will finish getting all the files. The client reboots, goes through what is known as a mini setup wizard, in which you answer the basic questions that you normally would answer installing Windows XP Professional, and then the client is ready and is already a member of the Active Directory. So let's see how we're going to accomplish this in our network. Going on to the next figure over here, I'm translating the previous figure, namely these services, to our actual network scenario, which is our benandbrady.com network. So here we go. We have our domain controller, namely DC1. On this, we need to meet all the prerequisites. So we'll make sure that we have Active Directory on this. We have DNS. We will install DHCP because we haven't done so. If you recall, Active Directory and DNS was installed in a set of videos. And then finally, we'll install a service known as RIS. And then on the client side, I do not have a PXE client. I have a computer that has a supported NIC card, and I'm going to use this to actually deploy Windows XP Professional. So let's get started. First, we will check our prerequisites. Once they're met, we will install DHCP and then install the service RIS. We'll configure RIS, and then finally, we will use a floppy disk to deploy Windows XP Professional on this. So I'm going to minimize the screen. And let's connect to our domain controller. So I have the remote desktop connection open over here. Let me log into the domain. So here is our domain controller. I am on DC1, and here's the IP address for this network, for this computer. So let's verify a few things. The first thing we need to verify is whether or not we have Active Directory installed. A couple of ways you can check that. Right click on DC1, Properties, Computer Name tab, and over here under full computer name, you can see the name of the computer is DC1, and it is part of the network benandbrady.com. Here's my domain. It also is telling me that I'm a part of this domain, benandbrady.com. How else can I know that this is a domain controller? Well, let's go to Start, Admin Tools, and then over here we have Active Directory actually installed and working. So let's verify that. Should take a moment to come up. Here we go. Okay, so here's our benandbrady.com domain and the various objects in this domain. So you're looking at a domain controller. I'm going to exit out of this. Now, do I have the second prerequisite was a DNS server? Well, we installed DNS server once we installed Active Directory on this computer. So let's check that. I'm going to go and find in the admin tools the program for DNS, which is right over here. Alright, so here is my DNS server. It says that DC1 is a DNS server for the benandbrady.com domain. I'm going to expand my forward lookup zone. Here's our domain, benandbrady.com. Expand this, and you can see that here is a client, or rather here is a computer account for the benandbrady.com domain. We have DC1, DC2, and this soon is going to be a client. So I have Active Directory, I have DNS already installed on my computer. The third requisite on the server side was the installation of DHCP, which I have not installed. So let's go ahead and install DHCP. To install any additional services on the server, you need to go to Control Panel and then go to Add Remove Programs, and then click on Add Remove Windows Components. And then over here, we'll pick up the service known as DHCP and then install the service. While I'm waiting for the screens to show up, let me tell you what you need, what different software you need to perform the activities in this lab. You will need the Server 2003 CD handy so that you can install additional services like the one that we're going to do now. You will need the CD for Windows XP Professional so that when Riz asks me to create an image, I have the CD available so it can copy the files. And of course, you need a floppy disk so that you can create the boot floppy for your client. So let's find the DHCP service over here. Go down over here, and under networking services, this is important, and I'm sure some of you are, or most of you are familiar with this. Never ever click in the checkbox over here. Windows actually thinks that you're uninstalling a service. Always select and then go to details. Okay, so a lot of people make that mistake. It sounds like a silly mistake, but it can actually cause a lot of damage to the server. And then here's the service that I need, DHCP. I want to select that, click on OK. And then in a few minutes, the DHCP service will be installed. Once the DHCP service is installed, we need to actually go and configure the DHCP server. I do not plan to show you all the different settings in a DHCP server, but what I'll definitely show you is the configuration of DHCP server that is sufficient for this exercise. Namely, we'll set up a scope, we will do some exclusions. In our options, we will set up the option for DNS server because that is required for our lab to work. And then finally, we will activate the scope and then authorize the server. If you're not familiar, if you're not completely familiar with DHCP server, not to worry. Whatever I'm going to show you is exactly what you need for this lab. If you would like to know more about DHCP server, there are other training courses available by Train Signal that you can look into and then learn each and everything that you need to know about the DHCP server. So I believe the service is done at this point. Let's go and close this. And this is a very common thing in Windows environment. It's a two-step process. You actually install the services that are required, and then you configure it. And I keep saying this again and again in my training class and in training courses. You install, you configure. You install, you configure. That ensures that your server is working properly. So we just installed a service. Let's go ahead and configure it. To install, you go to Control Panel, Add Remove Programs. To configure, you go to Start, Admin Tools, and over here, you should expect to find a new component, namely DHCP. So I'm going to click on that. And now we will configure our DHCP server for our network. So the very first thing we need to do is configure the DHCP scope on the server. To configure the scope, by the way, I'm sure you can see this red arrow pointing downwards, basically saying that my DHCP service is installed, but it's not configured. It's not doing anything at this point. So let's make it do something. I'm going to expand this and click on our domain, which is benandbrady.com. Right click, new scope, and the wizard starts. This wizard will help us actually set up the scope. Click on the next button on the welcome screen. This is simply a descriptive screen. Over here, I'm simply going to say Ben. Again, this is something that you will leave for yourself, a little note to let you know exactly what scope this is. So I'm going to just type over here, Ben and Brady's California network, and then leave the description alone. This would describe this even further. The name appears in the list over here. The description shows up as an additional property of that particular scope. Click on the next button. Starting IP address, you're going to use the whole range of a network, namely 200, 200, 201 to 200, 200, 200, 254. The subnet mask is automatically entered for me. Go on to the next screen. Here it needs to know the exclusions. These are the IP addresses that will not be assigned to clients on the network. We know that DC1 is taking 200, 200, 201, DC2 is taking 200, 200, 202. This is where you would add all the static IP addresses that are currently used on a network. As a safety precaution, what I'm going to do is exclude from 200, 200, 201 to 15, so that the first IP address that will be given out by the DHCP server will be 200, 200, 200.16. Going on to the next screen, it's letting me know how long the lease duration should be. 8 days is okay for us. And now it's asking me, do I want to configure other options now? Actually, I do want to configure one other option. If you recall, we require that the client know who the DNS server is, and that question the wizard did not ask me so far. So I need to answer that question. So let's say, yes, I would like to configure these options now. Click on the next button, and now it's asking us for the different options. Router, we really don't have, we just have one network, one subnet, so we don't need to put anything out here. I'm going to click on next, and then over here it wants to know the name of the parent domain. I'm going to type benandbrady.com, and now it wants to know who the DNS server is. Now the best way to do this is always type the name of your server over here and click on resolve. If it picks up the correct IP address like the way it did, you know that your network is in sync and things are going to work out okay. So I simply type DC1 over here, click on the resolve button. It gave me the correct IP address for my network that I expected. I'm okay with this. I'm going to click on the add button. So now my client will know exactly who the DNS server is, namely 200.200.200.1. Moving forward, Win servers, we don't have any. Do you want to activate the scope now? Yes. And then I'm going to finish this. Activating the scope basically means that the scope is active and it can give out IP addresses. If for some reason your scope is not active, simply right click on it, and here's the switch. Since it is active, I can deactivate it. If it was deactivated, then the word over here would be active. Alrighty, and then you can see that this is up and running now. Now I still have a red arrow pointing downwards because I need to authorize my DHCP server so that it can give out IP addresses. Without this, the client will not obtain an IP address. So I'm going to right click on this and then click on the word authorize over here. So now I'm sending a message to the Active Directory saying that this is a valid DHCP server and you may please give out IP addresses to clients that request it. This takes a few minutes to come up, actually about a minute or two. And I've noticed that the arrow does not change until you actually refresh your screen several times. So what I'm going to do is click on the F5 key, which is the refresh key, a few times, and it should be coming up any moment now. And if it does not come up, I've also noticed something else that works. You simply close this program, go back in and again, and then you will see that there is a green arrow pointing upwards. And here we go. Our scope is active. At this point, we have a DHCP server that is ready to give out IP addresses to clients. So let's close this. I'm sorry, I was trying to close the whole Windows session. We don't want that. I'm going to exit out of this. And here is our server DC1 with all the prerequisites ready. Let's double check that once again. I'm going to go back to this. We have Active Directory, we have DNS, we have DHCP. Now what remains is to install the service known as RIS. Once again, remember the two-step primer. You install the service and then you configure it. You install the service from, I'm back on DC1 by the way. You install the service from Control Panel, add more programs, and this time we'll look for the service known as RIS. Once it is installed, we will configure it. Should take a few seconds to come up. By the way, I've noticed sometimes this takes a little bit longer depending on how fast your computer is. Don't keep clicking on this. Actually, if you try to click on it now, it will give you this message saying that, well, another copy is running. Okay, so a lot of times what happens is it is running, but it's in the background. Let's see if that's the case in this scenario. There we go. Okay, so that happens quite often. Let me position this, and now I'm looking for the service known as Remote Installation Services. So let's go down this list. Networking, there we go. Remote Installation Services, I'm going to click on the checkbox. By the way, since we are over here, let me give you a little information, a little bit of more information in Windows Components Wizard. There are 3 states of checkboxes, and luckily for us, all the 3 states are visible over here. When the checkbox is blank, just like it is over here under Management and Monitoring Tools, that means that none of the programs or none of the components under Management and Monitoring is installed currently on the server. Alright, so that's one state. The other state is where it is clear in the back, but it is checked. This says that all the components of remote installation services are installed in this computer, which we're going to do soon. And the third state can be between the two, which is, and here's an example of that. Networking services, it is checked, but it is grayed out in the background. This basically means that there are some components of networking services installed, but not all of them. Okay, so this gives you a visual clue as to what is installed on your server. We'll click on the next button over here. And now it's going to start preparing the installation service over here. It's going to start copying the files. Again, this process can take a few minutes. And eventually it's going to ask me for a CD-ROM. And we'll talk about it. There's one more thing that we need to do on this computer, and I'll discuss it as soon as I see the message asking us to do that. So here we go. It's finished. Now it's going to go in the setup mode, and it's going to ask me to restart the computer. I'm just going to politely say no over here because I want to show you something else. Now this is a requirement. It does not show up in these lists over here because this is not a macro environment, but this is an environment within the domain controller itself that you must meet before you can successfully configure remote installation services. So let's see what the requirement is. Now I've installed a service but not yet configured it. Here's what I need to do. Let me take you to a tour of the disk of this computer. So I'm going to right click on DC1 and then go to manage. I would like to show you the partition structure of the hard disk on this computer. Here's our disk. It is about 40 gigabytes, 37.27 gigabytes. I have one partition created on this, about 10 gigabytes, and I have 27.5 gigabytes of free space available to me. I had made sure that this was the case before I actually started doing RIS. And the reason for this is the following. Once you install RIS, the service is installed, but actually when you start configuring it, it needs a partition that is different from the system partition. System partition is where the operating system itself is installed. So in our case, we have only one, and the Windows Server 2003 operating system is installed on the C drive. You cannot use you cannot configure RIS on the same partition as this. I've just installed a service, but to configure it needs a totally different partition from the system partition where it's going to put all the images. So what I need to do is actually create a new partition over here. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to say new partition. Click on next. Primary is fine for us, and I'm going to create. Let's make a 6 gigabyte partition. That should be more than enough for us. So about 6,000 megabytes. Click on next. Assign the following drive letter. That is okay. And here's the important part also. This partition must be NTFS. That's another requirement. Perform a quick format so that this process goes fast. Click on finish. And while this is actually happening, let me talk a little bit more about this. What will happen is the following. RIS will create a file structure, and it needs a separate partition from the system partition to create a file structure. So we'll be using this one as our RIS installation partition. Now over here, this partition must also be an NTFS partition. So those are the two requirements. Have a partition that is separate from the system partition, and it must be NTFS. Now, if you already have a partition that has some data on it, that's fine too. Okay, so please remember that it's not that this partition has to be empty. For example, if in your computer while you're doing the labs at home, you already have the C drive, and you have some your operating system is installed on the C drive. Now on the D drive, you may be using this drive to store some other data, but as long as you have enough free space available on it, I would say about 4 to 5 gigabytes, then feel free to use it. Okay, so I have my second partition created over here, and the partition is NTFS. Let's verify that. I have one drive here, and here's my other drive, which is NTFS. So I'm all set. Now I'm ready to actually shut down this computer and restart for the remote installation services to be in effect. So I'm going to shut down this computer. Once again, I'm on DC1, and I'm going to restart the computer like it told us to do. So click on the OK button over here. You have to type in a comment so that it knows why we're shutting it down. And I'm getting a message over here because I'm connecting remotely from my desktop to a server. So I'm going to click on the OK button, and soon we're going to lose the connection. So the server is going to shut down and restart. Here we go. The remote computer has ended the connection. Click on OK, and we are back. So it's going to take a few minutes to restart the server. Once the server restarts, I'll join you once again, and we'll continue. Now we have to configure the RIS server. To configure the RIS server so that you're ready with this also, if you're performing the lab with me while I'm showing you this. To configure the RIS server, you will need the Windows XP Professional CD, because at this point it will ask you for the CD so it can copy all the files from the CD-ROM to the new partition that we just created. So I'm going to pause the video over here and then join you once again once DC1 restarts. Okay, I'm back, and the client, or rather DC1, has just restarted. So let me minimize the screen, and let's connect once more to our domain controller via the remote desktop tool. Okay, it's trying to establish the connection at this point. There we go, we are in. Let's verify that. Actually, there's nothing to verify at this point. We need to actually go ahead and configure our service. So let's do that. Okay, so let's go to Start, Admin Tools, and over here we should have a new program waiting for us to be configured, namely Remote Installation Services. So let's go and find that. Going down the list over here, here we go. Remote Installation Services Setup. Those of you who've used this service in Windows 2000 Server may recall that this program actually was sitting in the control panel once again. So in other words, after the server restarted, you had to go back to the control panel to be able to configure the remote installation services. I think Microsoft did a great thing by moving it from there and putting it in the admin tool. So now it is consistent, so that my rule that I repeated before stays or holds, that you install a service from the control panel, and to configure the service you go to the admin tools. So I'm going to click on the remote installation services setup box over here so that we can finish our setup. Over here it says welcome to the remote installation service. This is basically a welcome screen, and once again it reminds you over here, this computer must be a member of the domain, which it is. In fact, it is a domain controller. You must have an active DHCP. Remember, we activated a scope, we authorized a server, and you must have a DNS server running. We do. A Windows CD or a shared folder that contains installation files. What I have done at this point is inserted the Windows XP Professional CD. Once again, please note, not the server CD. That's another mistake a lot of people make. Now you're trying to create the client. So what is going to be installed on the client? In our example, we are going to deploy Windows XP Professional. So I have the Windows XP Professional CD. If on the other hand you're deploying Windows 2000 Professional, you'll have that CD, or Windows 2003 Server CD if you want to deploy that. But please remember, just because you're sitting on a server, do not insert the server CD. This is the CD of the client you wish to deploy. And then of course, client computers that have either once again, or PXE boot ROM or a network adapter. So let's go on to the next one. And this is where your homework comes in really well. If you had not done the following, that is, create a separate partition and make sure that it is not the same as the system partition and it has enough space and it was NTFS, well, it automatically picks up that drive, and over there it's going to create a folder called remote install. Had we not done that, over here we would have seen an error message. We would have to abort, go back, create a partition, and then start all over again. So it's going to pick up the E drive. In there it's going to create and share a folder called remote install. Click on the next button. Now it's a question that we need to respond to. Client support, respond to client computers requesting service. This can be activated later on. A lot of people simply install a service and then activate the service later on. Over here we're going to say, well, go ahead and do that. Respond to client computers requesting service. This one, do not respond to unknown client computers, basically gives you some control as to what is known as a managed environment, where only certain client computers that you have predetermined actually get the images from the server. Well, in our environment we won't make it that restrictive, so I'm going to keep this on. But if you want to, you can use this by pre-creating the computer accounts in advance. This is also known as pre-staging. Click on the next button. Now it wants to know where the CD-ROM is. That's a D drive for me, and my CD-ROM is inserted in the computer at this point. I'm going to click on the next button, and now it should start copying the files from the CD-ROM to the E drive. It's asking me the name of the folders that will be created. I'm going to accept the name Windows, go on, and this is the description. It automatically came up with this title because I have the XP CD in it, Microsoft Windows XP Professional, and then here's a description. This is very useful if you have more than one client images on the RIS server, so that the user can actually go and select the first image or the second image and so forth. And then once they select the image, they can also have a little description at the bottom telling them exactly what that image is all about. So in our case, we'll leave it as Windows XP Professional. Click on the next button, and here's a summary screen telling me that I'm going to actually copy those files from the CD-ROM to the following location. I'm going to click on the finish button, and this does take a few minutes. I would say this is going to take between 15 to 20 minutes. I'll tell you exactly how long it took on my computer once this step is finished. So what I'm going to do is stop the video over here and then join you once the entire copying process is done. At this point, we would have finished all the requirements on the server side. Then we are ready to deploy the client. So I'll give you a little tour of RIS, and then we are ready to actually test this operation by installing Windows XP Professional on the client computer. So I'm going to stop the video over here and join you once this process is finished. The file copying process just finished. It took about, I would say, 35 minutes. Okay, so the process is done. All the files have been copied, and I'm going to click on the done button over here. I'm also going to promptly remove the CD-ROM so that it's no longer in the client computer, or rather on the server computer. And now let's navigate and find out what exactly took place. So on DC1, I'm going to go to, remember, the E drive is where the remote install was, the folder remote install was created, and this is where the RIS files were installed. I want to show you a couple of things. The first thing is I'm going to right click on this folder called remote install, go to sharing and security. I'm going to show you that this folder is shared as REMINST, okay, because we're going to be using a DOS client on the client side. It makes sure that it has a share name that is 8 characters or less. So this folder is actually shared as REMINST. So that's the first thing you need to know. The second thing is I'm going to double click on this folder. It created several subfolders within this. Let's go through each one of them. The first one I'm interested in is called the admin folder. This has programs that we will need for our client purposes. So in there's a folder called i386. I'm going to double click that, and there are two programs that we'll use. The first program that we're going to use in this particular lab is called the RBFG, also known as Remote Boot Floppy Generator. This program will actually, as you can see, the name is showing up right there, Microsoft Windows Remote Installation Floppy Generator. This program will let us create the client boot floppy because we do not have a PXE client. So we're going to use this program now. The next program that is of interest to us is what is known as RipRep. I'll use this in a different lab where I'll show you how to deploy an image that has not just the operating system but also applications installed on it. So once again, to show you the structure, here's the structure. In the E drive, it created a folder called remote install, and files were copied in there. One of the folders, also the subfolders, there is the admin folder. In there is the i386 folder, and in that folder we have two programs that is of interest to us. So going back over here, so that's the admin folder. The second folder that I would like to show you is what is known as a setup folder. So I'm going to double click on that setup folder. There's a subfolder called English. Double click on it. Here we go. There's a folder called images, and in there, if you recall, when we were configuring RIS, it asked us for the name of the folder in which to copy the Windows XP files. So and we accepted the default name of Windows. So here's that folder, and in there is the folder i386, and then all the files that are required for deploying Windows XP Professional has been copied over here. So that's a folder structure one more time. So here we go. Remote install, this time we went to the setup folder, English, images, Windows, i386. When we have additional images, you will see more than one folder over here, and in this manner, different images will be stored over there. Also, if you recall, one of the items was what is known as, let me minimize this and take you back to our figure over here. And if you look in the theory for remote installation services, there was a service called SIS, Single Install Service. What this did was, here's the following. I'm going to go back to this and take you back to the volume. This is the sys common store. As I said, what's going to happen is the following. The files that will be copied in the setup program under images, all the common files that are needed will not be duplicated, so that the images are not big and there is efficiency in the way the images are stored. So once again, I think we're done on the server side, and I navigated and showed you the file structure so that you understand exactly what has taken place. couple of more things to see. I'm going to close the screen. You saw the file structure for remote installation services. Now let's go to the Active Directory by going to the admin tools and then going to Active Directory users and computers. Over here, we will go to the object for the server, namely DC1. Remember, our server object is located under the domain controllers link over here. So I'm going to expand that and then find this object DC1. This is where I had installed the service called RIS. I'm going to right click on this, go to properties, and you will notice that there are more tabs available over here than there were before. These tabs are related to the RIS service. Here's a tab that is of interest to us, remote install, and over here are some of the options that can be configured to actually control the way the clients are set up on the server. So if you recall, going back to the remote install tab, here's the checkbox that we saw when we were configuring RIS, respond to client computers requesting service. Well, if you had not done it over there, you could go back over here and then click on this checkbox. The reason I'm showing you this is because unlike other services where you go to the admin tools and you have a separate item for it, for example, if I would like to configure, I'm going to close this for a moment. If I would like to configure DHCP server, what I do is I simply go to admin tools and then over there find the component known as DHCP and then configure the service. You will not find a component known as remote installation services. To do that, you need to go to Active Directory, find the computer object on which RIS has been installed. In this case, it is DC1, and go to the properties of that object, and you'll find the remote install tab. All the services are configured from here. So here's the first checkbox. The second checkbox, once again, is if you're trying to manage the clients in which you pre-create the computer account, and then only those computers will have RIS, Windows XP Professional installed on it. And then here's a good good button over here. This will verify that our RIS server is up and running and all the services are available to us. So let's do that. I'm going to click on this verify server button. It takes me to a wizard and it will check, and it has said that this remote installation server has been verified and no errors were detected. So that's a good message. We know that everything is running. In fact, it tells us that all the services that is needed, the binary service, the TFTP server service, DHCP service, DNS, and the Active Directory, they're all available. So I'm going to click on the finish button because that's a good message. And again, it checked for these things, it authorized the DHCP server, everything looks good. Okay, so this was a good check. I'm going to click on a done button. Then there are other advanced settings over here, which I'll go through after the deployment is done, so you'll have a better idea as to how to control the clients from this location. So I'm going to cancel out over here. So what we've done so far is made sure that the RIS server is up and running, and now we are ready to actually deploy clients. Now, how do we do that? I'm going to double click on this so that we know which is the server screen now. Now, let's get ready to deploy the client. On the client side, let's go back to our network figure over here. I'm done with this portion. Now, on this side, either I have a PXE client or I need to have a client that has a supported NIC card. The NIC card that we're going to use, I'm going to show you the example of the NIC card on the machine on which I'm doing this recording, because my client is going to be a similar machine. So I'm going to right click on the network places icon, go to properties, and here is the network card that I'm using. As you can see, it is a 3COM 3C918 integrated fast connection, and this is one of those NIC cards that is supported by RIS. Just look in this title bar that opened up. The name is 3COM 3C918 integrated fast Ethernet controller of the type T3C905B. So once again, that's important to note. It is of the type 3C905B-TX, because I need to find a card that is similar to this, and we will observe that this card is supported. So I just want to show you the NIC card that is installed on this one. And again, this is an important step simply because all NIC cards unfortunately are not supported. So you need to go to your client computer on which you're deploying Windows XP Professional and make sure that the NIC card is supported. Having said that, please understand that this requirement is present only for the client side. It does not matter what NIC card is on the server. The server will simply feed off the image from itself to the client. It is a client that is connecting. So the requirement that I'm talking about of a certain NIC card should be present only on the clients. Having said that, let's go back to our DC1. And then let's create the floppy disk using the program known as RBFG. So let's navigate and find that program. If you recall, we have to go to DC1 and then go to the volume where SYS was installed, namely E drive, remote install folder, admin, i386, and here's the program to generate the floppy disk. So I'm going to double click on this program, and it opens up the Microsoft Windows Remote Boot Disk Generator. Over here, I'm going to click on this button called the adapter list, and you can see these are the types of NIC cards that are supported, and only these NIC cards are supported. The list is actually growing from Windows 2000 to Windows Server 2003, but these are the only NIC cards that are supported. So for example, let's take the name of a popular NIC card that you may have used. For example, Linksys or Netgear. Well, they are not listed over here. So unfortunately, if that is one of the NIC cards that is on your client computer, you cannot use it. You'll have to change it to the following NIC cards that are supported by remote installation services. And that sometimes can be a big hindrance, but these are the only ones that are supported. So make sure you know that. And here's the other thing. You don't have to actually select your NIC card over here and then click on OK. This is simply a list. As long as your NIC card is on this list, it will create a generic floppy for any of those NIC cards. So I'm going to click on the OK button, and then I have just ensured that a floppy disk is in my disk drive on the server, and I'm going to click on this button called Create Disk. Very quickly, it's going to create a floppy disk for me that will be the remote floppy disk. It should take a few seconds, and then we'll look at the floppy disk. Here we go. The floppy has been created. Would you like to create another? I just need one. I'm going to click on the No button there, click on Close, and then we're done. Let me close the screen. And now let's go back to my computer. Here's the floppy disk drive, and in there actually just created one file, and look at the size of this file, 112 kilobytes. Amazing, isn't this? Let's see what this floppy will do. This floppy will do the following. It will boot your computer from the floppy disk, so your computer will start from it. It also has a DHCP client, so it's going to send out a message to the DHCP server. Let's bring up our network diagram. It's going to send a message to the DHCP server, which happens to be DC1 itself, and obtain an IP address from it. So it's going to boot the computer. It's going to send a message to the DHCP server and obtain an IP address. So the IP address comes back over here. Once it has done that, it will contact the RIS server and say that, well, I need an image. And the RIS server is going to download the file using the TFTP protocol to the client. The first file that is downloaded is called the CIW, or the Client Installation Wizard, which you will follow, answer some questions, and once those questions are answered, then it will copy all the files that from the RIS server over here to the client using TFTP. Windows XP Professional is now ready to be configured over here. The computer will shut down when you restart the computer. You will have to go through a mini setup wizard and answer the general questions like you normally do. Name of the registered user of this computer, the administrator's password, and so forth. If you want to automate that, you can do that by creating an answer file. So you simply run the wizard, and then this computer is up and running. It will also actually automatically join the domain and be a client of the domain benandbrady.com. So one little file does a lot, and our floppy disk is ready. So let's actually perform this activity now. I'm going to close this. Now what I'm doing is, at the same time of explaining this process, what I've done is I've taken the floppy disk from DC1 and inserted it into the client computer. Alright. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut down the client. Okay, so I'm going to power off the client and then restart the client with the floppy disk in there. Now, since I cannot capture the screens because it's a DAW screen and my recording software does not allow me to do that, what I've done is the following. So as the activity is taking place on the client computer over here, what I've done is I've created a series of screenshots, which by the way is also in the lab book, and this is what you will notice. When the computer starts, you will get a message that says press F12 to continue, and let me show you what the screen looks like. So let me switch screens here for a moment. I'm going to go to the window here and pick up the other screen I want to show you. So when your computer starts from the floppy disk, you will see that the floppy disk will load the NIC card driver. So here's the NIC card driver. If you recall, our NIC card was 3C90XB. It loaded the driver for the NIC card, and then the NIC card, when it found that it needs to obtain an IP address, it tried to contact the DHCP server, as you can see over here. The DHCP server gave it the IP address, and then it contacted the RIS server, and then the TFTP process started, where the client installation wizard came from the RIS server to the client. And then you have to press F12, and then the moment you click on the F12 screen, you will see the client installation wizard running. So once again, let me repeat this process. Let's go back to our figure over here. The client will boot with the floppy disk, and then try to obtain an IP address from here. So this is the screen that shows you how that happens. It tries to load the NIC card driver and it successfully does so. Otherwise you would see some error messages over here. Once it found an IP address, so here's it trying to obtain the IP address, then it contacts the RISC server. RISC server activates a service known as TFTP and then transfers the client wizard. Now the client is ready for you to press the F12 key so it can show you the wizard on the screen. The moment you press the F12 key, by the way, this screen does not stay for too long. I would say about 5 seconds. If you miss the screen, you will see a message saying that it timed out. Not a problem. Simply power off the computer, power on. This time be ready with a finger on the F12 key ready, so that the moment you see the screen you can press the F12 key. So something similar to what we used to do for Windows 2000 to get on the advanced screen by pressing the F8 key. You have to be ready to press the key at a certain time, otherwise it's too late. But again, if you miss that, that's okay. Shut down, power off the computer, power on, and this process will repeat itself. So press the F12 key and then you will see the following screens one after another. The very first screen is what is known as the client installation wizard. This is the wizard that will guide you through the RISC process. So the very first wizard will basically welcome you, and then you have to press on the key to continue, and then it will contact the Active Directory, and it will require you to enter the username and password of the administrator. So here it is. I used the username administrator and the password is password, and here it's telling me that it contacted the benandbrady.com domain. So you know which RISC server you've contacted in that domain. Continuing further, once you click on that, it will tell you, here it is, it's telling us you connected to the server DC1. Once that is done, then you will see a screen that is this. It's warning you, here's a caution message, that all data on the hard drive will be deleted. So what RISC does is it actually formats the entire hard disk and creates one big partition. So if you have a 20 gig hard disk, it will create one big 20 gigabyte partition on the hard disk, and then install Windows XP on it. So please remember, all the data on that client computer will be wiped out. And then you press enter to continue. Once you press enter to continue, you will be presented with the next screen. This screen is telling you that your computer name will be administrator1, and this can be controlled, and I'm going to show you how to control the screen. Basically over here it's saying is that it will create a client computer whose name will be administrator1. What it did was it took the username. Remember, we entered the username administrator to log on to the RISC server. It takes the username and increments it by 1. So if you have more than one client getting deployed at the same time, once again, you can do that, by the way. You don't have to do this one client at a time. If you have 50 machines, put in the floppy disk, start all of them simultaneously or one after another. Okay, and as the first computer reaches the RISC server and authenticates, what will happen is it will give it each of them a computer name of the username, which is the administrator in this case, and increment it by 1. And then it creates what is known as a GUID, a globally unique ID that uniquely identifies that computer to the Active Directory. So here we go. This computer will be given a name administrator1, and here's the unique ID. And then it's saying that the server supporting this computer is DC1, which is basically your RISC server. You click on to begin setup, press the enter key, you click on the enter key, and then Windows XP, the files start getting copied from the RISC server to the client. The screens you'll see will be similar to the screens that you see when you actually are installing XP yourself. So once again, the biggest advantage of using this RISC method is so that you can simultaneously deploy clients without actually having to sit down in front of each computer and spend a lot of time on it. I know it takes a lot of time trying to set it up, but eventually once this works, what will happen is the following. Let me go back to our network diagram over here. Once it starts working and you have several clients in your network, once this RISC server is configured properly, simply go to each of these clients, start a computer with a floppy disk, answer a few basic questions, move on to the next computer, and so forth. And then all these clients will get the operating system from over here. Now this is great. Let's say that you have just deployed 50 clients on your network, and then a few days later your company decides to buy 2 additional computers, and now you have to put the image on that computer as well. Well, what you do is the following. You simply go to those 2 computers, insert the floppy disk in, and then just go through the process, and they'll be added to your domain automatically in this manner. In fact, this is something that you can assign a junior administrator as well. I do this with my clients all the time. Once I create the RIS server, I show them the procedure, only the procedure on the client side. Basically, that's not much. Simply insert a floppy disk, answer a few questions, and then what I also do is make an answer file for them just to make the process easy for them. And then simply say insert the floppy disk, walk away, come back, and then the client will be ready. All right. So this is a great method of actually deploying clients in a Windows Active Directory environment. Let's now go to DC1 and check the progress of this activity. While I was explaining this process to you, I had inserted a floppy disk and gone through the screens that I just showed you, and I'm going to go to DC1 and let's go to our DHCP server, and here we go. As you can see that an IP address of 200.200.200.16 was assigned. If you recall, here's the address pool that we had set up. We had set up the IP range from 200.1 to 254, and then we said that exclude 1 to 15. So the next client will get an IP address of 200.200.16, and then this process is taking place in the background. Like all the screens that I just showed you will be repeated, and eventually this client will be able to join the domain. So I'm going to close the screen, and this process should take a good, I would say, about 40 to 45 minutes. And that brings us to a discussion of exactly what RIS is, what the limitations of RIS are. So I'm going to go through this process one more time in the next lab, where I'll show you how to actually deploy Windows XP along with the applications. But while we're talking about this, let's have a general discussion of what RIS is, how it is good, and what are some of the limitations of RIS. The first thing that you need to understand about RIS is that it requires a pure Windows 2000 or Windows 2003 Active Directory environment. In other words, it needs an Active Directory. If you have a Novell server, you can use a set of method to actually deploy a client. Okay, so it needs Active Directory, it needs the services, DNS, DHCP, and of course you need to install and configure the RIS service on the client computer. So if in your network you have a pure Windows Active Directory environment, you're all set. You can actually use RIS without installing and without investing in a third-party software to actually deploy clients to your network. So that's a good thing. Now here are some of the limitations of RIS. The first limitation is, well, you got to have this kind of an environment, and the second thing is that on the client you need to have either a PXE client, and if your computer does not support that, it better have a NIC card that is supported. Like we said, if you have a Linksys card, for example, and it is not listed as a PXE environment card, then you cannot use that client. You'll have to change the NIC card on that to one that is supported and then use that. So that becomes a big limitation. The second limitation, and a very obvious one, is the fact that the only operating systems that are supported at this point are Windows 2000 Professional, not even Windows 2000 Server. Once again, just Windows 2000 Professional, Windows XP Professional, and Windows Server 2003 in all the different kinds, the standard and the enterprise and so forth. Okay, so those are the only operating systems that are supported. So in your network, if you are using Windows 98 as well, or Windows Millennium, well, you're out of luck. You cannot use RIS to deploy images of those machines. And the third thing is, and that's a limitation in the beginning and will make it go away, it is designed by default to install operating systems only, and only the operating systems that I mentioned. So I cannot actually prepare a computer and take an image right away and then install that image. The first thing I have to do is prepare what is a base image, and that's exactly what we did. A base image is an image of the supported operating system only, namely Windows XP Professional, Windows 2000 Professional, or Windows Server 2003. So you have to create that. Once that image is created, then I can go ahead and install other applications and then deploy that application, those applications as well, which we are going to do, by the way, in the next lab. So the very first lab that we did, we simply had Windows XP Professional deployed, and the image was created for us. So as long as you understand the limitations of and the environment in which RIS works, you're okay. As long as those requirements are met, you should be fine. So going back to a summary diagram, summary note over here, client deployment options. You can deploy clients going around with the CD-ROM, use the application CD and the operating system CD to install clients. You can do it off a central server, or you can install the operating system and let the GPUs do this, which was discussed in the previous series of videos, or you can use RIS for operating system and or applications. In this video, I only showed you how to do this for the operating system. You can also do this along with applications, which is a subject of discussion in the next video. And the limitations that I just told you will actually go away if you use a third-party imaging software known as Ghost, which will be the video to come also in the series. So in other words, if you would like to deploy an image that has, for example, Windows 98 as the operating system, you cannot use RIS. However, you can do that using Ghost. Also, you need to understand the following. As I'm sure when you do this lab, you will notice that it's mostly an unattended installation. The files are being copied from the server to the client in an unattended manner, one after another, just like you would do if you had a CD-ROM. So when you install XP Professional using a CD-ROM, you've noticed that the files get copied and the process starts, and then you go through the screens and so forth. In other words, you're still actually installing the operating system on the client. The only difference is a lot of clients are getting it simultaneously, and there is some level of automation that you can perform using RIS. However, when you use a third-party software such as Ghost, you do not have to go through the screens. It's a true imaging software where the image is actually thrown on the hard disk of the client, and then the client gets an operating system. And also, there are no limitations as far as how big or how small the hard disk can be. In RIS, you notice that it did not ask you for how big to make a partition on the client hard disk. It simply takes the whole hard disk. So if you have a 100 gigabyte hard disk, it's going to create one big 100 gigabyte partition and install Windows XP on it. So as long as you remember these restrictions, you're okay. And again, it sounds like a lot of restrictions, but it is a great method of actually deploying clients in a pure Active Directory environment without buying a third-party and expensive software such as Ghost. So this should conclude the video. This is the first part of the video, installing remote installation services and deploying clients. I thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you very soon in the second video, in which we will deploy XP as well as the application Microsoft Office 2003. Thank you very much.